Good morning. Welcome to today's genealogy program. Today is July 20th, 2024. I'm Jessica Ashton from the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center, and we are coming at you from City Hall as usual. And before we get started today, I want to jump into just a couple announcements because we do have some fun stuff coming up. I want to make sure we don't run out of time at the end. So make a note of these if any of them sound interesting to you. And you can always contact the museum for more information. Also, keep an eye on our website at museum.canyoncity. I'm sorry, it changed. canyoncity.org/museum. Okay, so next Wednesday, that's July 24th, we have our monthly community coffee program. And so we invite anybody from the community down to join in on the conversation. This month's topic will be ranching in Fremont County specifically. So if you have any stories yourself, or you know anyone who maybe grew up in the ranching industry or is in the ranching industry, encourage them to come down. It's a lot of fun. It'll start at 9 a.m. at the museum, and we just kind of see where the conversation goes. If you don't know anything about ranching, that's fine too. You can come down and listen. So that'll be Wednesday, July 24th, 9 a.m. at the museum. There's no registration required. You can just stop on by. Then Saturday, August 3rd, we have another fun program coming up, and it's a kids fossil activity day. So if you know any kids in the area or who would be visiting the area on the 3rd of August, there's no registration for that either. It's a free event. It's from 10 to 2. It'll be open house style, so just stop on by. We'll have a bunch of different booths set up with different activities for the kids. And then the last one I want to talk about today is August 7th, and that's a Wednesday at 5:30 p.m. We will be meeting out at Lakeside Cemetery to honor our Purple Heart veterans that are buried here in Canyon City. And so August 7th is the National Purple Heart Day, and so we want to take a moment to honor those veterans. Okay, so if you have any questions on any of that or any other questions in general, you can always call the museum 719-269-9036. Email us at historycenter@canyoncity.org or stop on by 612 Royal Gorge Boulevard. Okay, now that we got that done, we can get into the genealogy program. Today's program is on settlement houses. And as usual, Terri has done the research, and Terri Meeks, and she will be presenting it. So I will hand it over to you, Terri. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica, and good morning. Today we are going to talk about the settlement house movement. And I guess the best way to get started is to find out exactly what a settlement house is. Essentially, what we know today as a community center. They originally started in inner city areas and were designed to provide educational, recreational, and social services to the community. And we're going to look at the history of this entire movement, and specifically at some of the settlement houses and what they actually did for their local communities. Like so many of the programs that we do have in the United States, the history starts in England, but it is a late movement. It started in 1884 with Samuel Augustus Barnett, and he founded what is now known as Toynbee Hall. East London was a slum area, and to the best of my knowledge, it still is an underdeveloped area of London. And the point was for men that had education, university men, to actually move into the neighborhood, a working class neighborhood, to settle there. And their purpose was to help relieve poverty, to start programs that would provide education, that would help them with social services if they existed at the time. and it came under the category of perform good works. Living with the residents in these particular areas, it also introduced these university men to the real world, and they grew and understood and learned what it was like to eke out a living or to live in poverty. So that would help them set up social programs to, in turn, aid the local residents. Most of the settlement houses in England were religious-based, and they provided basic needs. They did offer food and shelter, and they tried to introduce some basic education so that people could improve their lot in life. Many were supported by private charities, wealthy donors, and sometimes communities funded these organizations. And this is Toynbee Hall. It looks rather grand. And not only did the university men settle there, but they would also take in some of the local residents to help teach them and to provide some of the services offered. So the settlement movement in the United States corresponded with the Progressive era. This was a time between 1896 and 1917. And it was they identified a whole list of social needs in the United States in particular. After the Civil War, people started moving to the cities, thus creating these slums and the tenements. It was the advance in industrialization that provided the impetus. There were jobs now in factories, so people were leaving the farms to come to the big cities. Also in the United States, in the 1880s to roughly the 1920s, we had millions of immigrants coming from Europe, Eastern Europe, to settle in the United States. And for the most part, they came to port cities along the East Coast. And those cities were forced to absorb those millions of people, and they in turn had needs. The result of this progressive era was the development of the profession of social work. And one of the other movements at the same time, of course, was the struggle for women's suffrage. And we will see that a lot of the people that participated in these settlement houses worked for all of these particular areas of improvement. Some of the differences from the English system, as I've described, was we had a large population of recent immigrants. And in order to help them adjust and integrate into the society of the United States from their homeland, various programs were established. In many cases, these settlement houses acted as advocates on behalf of the immigrants. English language classes, help with naturalization papers, help with finding employment, etc. And they established what they called penny banks. Many of the classes and the clubs and the offerings cost a mere penny. So they would collect pennies from the adults, the residents, children, that would allow them to take part in many of the programs that were sponsored. One of the other things that they also did in terms of immigrants was they didn't want the people to lose their heritage. They wanted them to still value their heritage. So they would sponsor festivals or gatherings of some sort in order to highlight and emphasize the heritage of these various peoples. This is a picture of a New York City street, Lower East Side. And you can see this is what these settlement houses were up against. The selling of stuff on the streets, just the sheer numbers of people, and to me at least, seeming chaos. So the first United States settlement house was the Neighborhood Guild, set up in New York City. And this was in 1885, just a year after Toynbee Hall. It was founded by Dr. Stanton Coit, and he was a PhD, not a medical doctor. And he was attending graduate school at Columbia University, and he lived in the slums to work with these people. He was from an affluent family, had a A1 education at Yale. He got his PhD in Germany. And before returning to the United States in 1885, he actually stayed for 3 months at Toynbee Hall and worked there. So he knew what he wanted to do. He eventually found a building, and he provided educational and recreational services on a daily basis. And he worked to bring about basic social reforms. Here is a picture of Stanton Coit as a young man. He, however, did not stay in the United States for very long. He went back to England in 1887, actually applied for English citizenship, and remained there for the rest of his life. So what happened to the work that he was doing? The Neighborhood Guild was reorganized in 1891, and it became known as the University Settlement. And with these two gentlemen, Charles Stover and Edward King, in charge, they did a lot of sociology studies. They studied the causes of poverty, what needed to be addressed in these tenement city situations. And they published these studies. So they were not only ministering to the people in their local area, but they were actually doing and publishing studies. Their idea was to promote social reform. They did get involved in the political process so that they could introduce legislation in various areas, unemployment, education, conditions for working women. They wanted to do away with the sweatshops. They wanted to institute a minimum wage, this number of hours people were working. They looked at the medical status of these various neighborhoods. We saw the extremely crowded tenement conditions. So what were the medical conditions in those housing units, and how could they better the situation? And because of so many immigrants, the number of cases in terms of evictions were huge. And they studied and sought remedies for that situation as well. And here is a picture of the University Settlement House after it had been renamed. And you'll notice that a lot of these are large city buildings, but they did take in residents as well as those that were educated and doing the teaching and training. The University House, this was some of the target areas that they chose to seek improvements in. And some of the studies that they actually produced reflected these topics. Housing, how to provide more housing, better housing. Tenements may have had, 20 or 30 people living in 2 rooms with a single outside facility for the whole building. Streets and refuge. Streets were not paved. There was no garbage collection service. Where were children to play? And it's surprising to realize that playgrounds did not exist at this time. Public schools were another one of their interests. Many schools were private schools where tuition was charged. The labor movement, we've mentioned that women and the sweatshops, the 40-hour work week, these were all pipe dreams at this particular time. And it was through politics that they would get their influence. The progressive era reformers were alarmed by the spread of the slums and the explosion of poverty. And so they wanted, one of their particular targets was the political machines and the bosses that ran them. They were also against, in terms of economics, the monopolies and the trusts that existed. And it was a time when the middle classes were finally being established. People were looking down on the extremely rich. They wanted to bust those trusts and allow people to come up into the middle class, and public transportation so that people could get to the jobs. Another one of the largest settlement houses, and one of the most famous, was Hull House in Chicago. It was founded in 1889 by Jane Addams, and her name is very, very prevalent across many of these efforts, as well as her coworker, Ellen Gates Starr. And they served primarily European immigrants in their particular area. Founded in 1889, by 1911, they had expanded to 13 buildings. So you can imagine the need in that particular area. They added a summer camp for children, and they became the standard bearer for the movement. Many of the following settlement houses were modeled after the Hull House and the programs that they had. And when we look at some of the information about various settlement houses, you'll see the wide variety of services that they did provide. The Hull House remained in service until January of 2012. That's pretty remarkable. And here is a picture of the Hull House. And we can see that there are multiple buildings there, but they eventually expanded to 13. It was, quote, a community of university women. And they wanted to provide social and educational opportunities for working class people. They were more scholarly, let's say, providing classes in literature, history, art, and domestic activities. And we're going to see a book later on that explains some of these domestic activities. They did have lectures and concerts for free, and they operated various kinds of clubs for children and adults. And like the New York and Boston houses, they studied the causes of poverty and published. They also pressured the various legislatures to enact social reforms to help these people. Here is from one of their 1890s publications, and it shows a nationality map so that you can see the immigrant population that they were serving at the time. The dark blue on the right-hand side, those represent Italians. The yellow, kind of over on the left, were Bohemians. Those are Czech people. The rust color are Russians. The white are English-speaking peoples. The green are the Irish, and the purple, which are scattered throughout, were the German people. So we see, and this is just one ward in Chicago. So we see the various ethnic populations that are living there that they were serving at this time. To be honest with you, I had not heard any of these names, but these women all made names for themselves and are famous in their own right for the work that they did. Ms. Kelly worked to end labor and racial discrimination. Dr. Hamilton focused on occupational health. Ms. Lathrop, children, the mentally challenged, and she was an advocate for the handicapped. So each one had a specific focus. And these people, these women, all lived and served at Hull House. Ms. Breckenridge was very active in the women's suffrage movement and in civil rights, and she was helped to start the NAACP. Grace Abbott was one of the women that did a lot of the studies, and so she developed the process for collecting and incorporating sociological data. So much of the work that she did went into the publications. Edith Abbott was a pioneer in the profession of social work, and she helped to establish Social Security legislation. Mary Kenney, who will appear again, was an organizer in the labor movement and particularly in organization of unions. And Alzina Stevens was also a labor leader and reformer. In Boston, there was the Denizen House. The house was donated by Cornelia Warren, a wealthy socialite, and the house itself was founded in 1892 by an organization called the College of Settlements Association. The association had been founded 5 years earlier by a small group of Wellesley College faculty and alumni. It was solely woman-run. And like I said earlier, it's one of the ones that was modeled after the Hull House and proved to be extremely successful. And like Hull House, we see multiple buildings in a city area. And this is where I talk about some of the unique programs. They responded to particular needs of a neighborhood at perhaps a particular point in time. So here's the panic of 1893, financial panic, and they're distributing milk and coal at this time. So they're responding to the need of the neighborhood, not just the large scale programs of education. So they did offer classes in nursing, crafts, cooking, and carpentry. So a full spectrum. Many of the houses had sports activities, organized sports activities, and many of them also did provide summer camp for children. They had clubs for both children and adults. The Denizen House had a library, a gymnasium, and a clinic. And like the others, they encouraged immigrants to celebrate their heritage. And here are a couple of the residents that were at Denizen House. Emily Balch was an economist, and in 1946, she actually won the Nobel Peace Prize for her work with the sociology of immigration. She was very interested in working with various nations to establish relationships with them, to provide give and take with them in terms of sociological issues. Ms. Dudley was the director of the Denizen House for almost 20 years, from 1893 to 1912. And she was a leader in the movement. Mary Kenny, that we saw at the Hull House, is now married. She's Mrs. O'Sullivan, and she's at the Denizen House in Boston. And we all are familiar with the name Amelia Earhart. She was from a well-to-do family in the Boston area, and she too volunteered her time and her service at the Denizen House before going on her various flying feats. The nurses' settlement was established in 1893 by Lillian Wald in New York City. There were multiple settlement houses in some of the larger cities. And their focus initially was simply on nursing care. In 1895, Jacob Schiff purchased 265 Henry Street. They later added a gymnasium, and while I said they initially provided nursing care, they expanded greatly, having a neighborhood, a playhouse established, and in 1927, an actual music school. And here is a picture of the nurses' settlement, sometimes also called the Henry Street Settlement. And it still exists today. Here are some of the firsts that this settlement house established. They were among the first, especially in healthcare. They established the first off-street playgrounds, funded the first public school nurse. They started the visiting nurse service, opened one of the first mental health clinics, one of the first transitional housing facilities for homeless, and established the first safe haven shelter for women in New York City. This is a picture of my mother. She worked for the Henry Street Settlement, as a visiting health nurse during World War II. And her job was to teach prenatal and postnatal care to Italian immigrants. And she always carried that black bag. The settlement house movement started in 1885 in the United States. So a short 12 years later, there were 74 settlement houses. By 1900, over 100, and 400 in 32 states by 1910. And many of them are still in operation today. They were financed by donations. The residents paid their own room and board. And as I've mentioned, they had the penny banks so that the classes and activities cost mere pennies. While we think of settlement houses as being in large cities, the movement did expand to also include small communities as well as regions that were very, very small. The Hindeman Settlement School in Kentucky was founded in 1902. And it was the first rural settlement school. Here again, it was a center for education, healthcare, and social services, the recreation, the libraries, the other facilities. And in particular, they wanted to preserve the cultural heritage of the Appalachian Mountains, southeastern Kentucky, as well as central Appalachia. And not all the buildings were huge city buildings. Some of them were mere log cabins. There was also the Pine Mountain Settlement School, founded in 1913. The land was donated by Mr. Creech, and he wanted to serve the southeastern mountains, still providing those social services for the community. He recruited these two women to establish and run the school, and the students actually boarded at the school. It was for children. And the campus was self-sustaining. They established a farm so that they were able to sustain themselves without having outside input. And here is a picture of the Pine Mountain Settlement School. And while it initially served the 1st through 8th grades, it went on to transition to a boarding high school later on. And then by 1949, it had merged with the county school system and became a day school. They did offer kindergarten through 8th grade, and they had a program for preschoolers as well. Most of the settlement houses were segregated, but they did establish separate institutions in Black neighborhoods. And they focused on studying Black urban communities. It was through some of the work of these settlement schools that helped also establish the NAACP. The Croom Settlement School was set up in 1899 and in Maryland, and it was originally named the Croom Industrial and Agricultural Institute of St. George's County. Pretty long name. And it was part of a specific African-American education movement. By 1918, the title was shortened and it became the Croom Settlement School, which closed in 1952. Here's a brief article from 1908 talking about the founding. The work of this institute, which is for the Christian training of colored boys and girls, began in 1899 by Miss Susie Wills, sister of the then rector of Croom. Miss Wills secured funds to build a chapel where she and her sisters taught Sunday school. In 1901, a farm of 60 acres was bought for an industrial school. And next year, a schoolhouse was built and also a parsonage for the colored minister. A charter was maintained or obtained from the legislature of Maryland, incorporating the institute and industrial training was begun. So did you have someone in your family that might have been influenced by a settlement school, worked at a settlement organization, or was the beneficiary of some of the services of a settlement house? One of the ways is to obviously look at our census. And by entering settlement house or the actual name of a settlement house into the keyword listing, you might find where your person might have been located. City directories, as well as Google Books, also have a lot of information about settlement houses. Here again, if you do that search by settlement house or the specific name, you will find things. Newspapers also have listings of people that might have served in settlement houses or graduates of a settlement school. Here is a census, a 1920 census. And we see we've got some women here. And we see further down that they are social workers at the settlement house. This one happens to be in Houston, Texas. And these are all professional women, some young, some approaching middle age, and from various areas. This is Benwood City, West Virginia. And again, we have 3 teachers that are living at a settlement house. And we also see that while many were born in the United States, their heritage is from overseas. And we see no occupations for these last 3 young people, but they might have been receiving their schooling. They were at least residents in the settlement house there. Here we have a whole page. This is the 1930 census, and this actually happens to be the New York settlement house in New York City. And we notice that we have a number of people that are social workers, but we also see other occupations as well. But these people were all residents at a settlement house. They might have been working for the settlement house, or they might have been working in the community, but they were taking advantage of the residents' ability, and they were paying for their room and board. And this was the Depression era. So the settlement houses were ministering to those people as well. This is as late as the 1950. We see that Herbert and Isabel Peters are both social workers at a settlement house in Upper Southampton, Pennsylvania. Here is a whole page listing from 1930 from the Hull House. And while we don't see too many immigrants, here again, it's Depression time, and we are seeing people that are the janitor, other occupations. There's artists, there are doctors, there are lawyers that are living in these settlement houses during this particular time. And likewise, in 1940, here is a whole page listing from the Dennison House in Massachusetts. And we see in this particular case that we've got a number of people that were born that are Chinese, and they are living in the settlement house. City directories will also pop out sometimes with settlement house information. In the backs of city directories, you will have the actual institution, the neighborhood house, and you see a listing of who might be a resident at those houses. Here's 1951, pretty late in the movement. We have Mary Hannock, and she is a head worker at the Genesee Settlement House in Rochester, New York. Here she is in the 1950 census, and it just says that she's a social worker for charities. What was really interesting to me when I looked up her name, it also popped up with a New York State Legislature resolution and award for honoring Mary Hannock for her work in the American Red Cross. She had done extensive charitable work in education in Rochester, and she applied to serve the Red Cross overseas during World War II. She was ineligible because she only weighed 98 pounds. And at the bottom, it says that Mary Hannock overcame this obstacle and secured a position. When women didn't weigh enough to volunteer for the services during World War II, if they were something like 98 pounds, the recruiters told them to go home and eat bananas and drink milkshakes and come back within the next couple of days. They would then weigh the 100 pounds that was the minimum at the time for a woman to serve. And it goes on to talk about her citation. What is also interesting is that the Library of Congress actually has an oral interview with Mary Florence Hannock about the work she did for the Red Cross, as well as covering some of the other work. At the time that she did the interview, she was 98 years old and lived to be 102. So, books. There are numerous books that are written about the settlement houses. Some of them are highly technical and talk about the reports, the studies that were performed, and the resolutions, the legislation that was introduced as a result of their work. But some of them also go through and talk about the members that were there. Here, for example, and I believe, yeah, this is the first one, yeah. This is a book that is organized by state, and it goes through and it lists all the settlement houses, where they were located, if they had a former name, if there is a religious connection with them. And it gives the history of each one, when they were established, what neighborhood they served, and you can see what kinds of opportunities, what they maintain. A nursery, a kindergarten, a library, gymnasium, and athletics, music, boys' clubs, milk and baby hygiene in cooperation with Chicago Women's Club, vacations in cooperation with the fresh air agencies. And I remember as a child hearing advertisements on the radio to give money to the Fresh Air Fund to send children to camp. It does list in some cases individual residents. In most cases, it's a summary of the numbers of workers that they have. But they do also list sometimes those workers in the house. Here is one from Massachusetts. And we see some that are still associated with churches. We have an Episcopal and we have a Methodist. They have religious services, a kindergarten, resident visiting nurse, pure milk station, daily clinics, rummage sales, classes in sewing, cooking, and carpentry, clubs, entertainment, playgrounds, baths, games. So we see the variety of activities and the needs of the people in these various neighborhoods. Still with segregation, we have the Stillman branch for colored people. And we have Settlement House, another one in Bristol, Tennessee. And here's one that is really interesting. This house, they have two separate sections. The work that was done prior to the earthquake in San Francisco, and another that the work that they were doing after the earthquake and fire. So their role and their needs changed as necessary. In other books, you might find the history. And this is one that I found particularly humorous. They issued a cookbook. And I had mentioned earlier about housekeeping, how to sweep. Before beginning to sweep, see that no food is left uncovered in the room and that all movable articles and furniture are taken out of the room. Really? Sweep from the edges of the room toward the center. Sweep with short strokes, keeping the broom close to the floor. Turn it edgewise to clean cracks. Always sweep a floor before washing or scrubbing it. And how to dust a room. So some of these are, to us in this day and age, very humorous. But you have to realize that they were ministering, or they were helping an immigrant population. And some of these men and women may have lived with dirt floors, may not have had dishes, may not have had things that required dusting. So these were all perhaps new skills to them that were being taught. Here's a first anniversary program with the names of people that are serving in the various aspects. So was someone in your family a worker at one of these organizations. The various clubs broken down by ages, boys 11 to 14, 14 to 16, 16 years and older. The first part of each Tuesday evening is passed quickly and merrily with games, and happy time closes with a short talk or story. The little fellows have had special celebrations at Thanksgiving and Christmas. And here is their leader, Ms. Cadwallader. And can a little boy like me come in and look at picture books? So, yes. Did one of your family perhaps make a donation to a settlement house? Were they involved in clubs? A sewing school. It has a membership something over 100. The masculine element being represented by one table of little boys who do advanced kindergarten work. Singing, storytelling. At 3 o'clock, the children sew. And the other half hour is spent in marching and gymnastics. A penny with each child that each child brings goes into a fund from which we have had a number of celebrations. So those penny banks. Newspaper articles. Here we have Jane Addams mentioned specifically for Hull House and their emphasis on maintaining their heritage. We also see perhaps celebrations. This is a 50-year span where this gentleman in Cleveland, George A. Bellamy, was the founder of Hiram House, and he is still serving 50 years later. So it was founded in 1896. And here is the playground for Hiram House. And it's interesting that it has to be behind walls. And we see listings of various houses and the types of things that they do. They have a dispensary. Small and does its work in a quiet way. The residents all have regular occupations and simply give their spare time to work. The Peabody House, the Adam House. And we have individuals. For a time, a resident. She organized a glee club and taught a class in singing. Ms. Frances Knowlton, Ms. Mary Palmer, and others were residents at a time. So who was a resident and what did they go on to do and accomplish? So we see many, many citations for women, especially, but it wasn't only women. Men also did work and serve in the settlement houses. This is one that I found another one that I found particularly humorous. A stuffed baby, a new social worker with limited experience had complained or had used hyperbole in discussing the situation. But as a matter of fact, this is a feeding of a child, a stuffed baby. The mother had just given the little one, weaned some weeks before, his morning meal. It consisted of a cup of coffee, a plate of cucumbers, 4 cold pancakes, and a slice of watermelon. It was the few remaining bits of this feast that the settlement worker eyed in such horror, and then turned to the mother with an entreaty not to give the baby such food or she would kill it. "Oh, them victuals are all right," returned the mother, picking up the puny and ailing child. "No," she sighed, "he ain't very well, that's a fact, but it ain't his food. I ain't never had no luck raising boys anyway." So this is what these workers were up against. And we have some success stories as well. Here is a man that was grew up in a settlement house, got his start as a coach at a settlement house, and has gone on to be a professional, famous basketball coach. And we have also articles about what the various settlement houses did and focused on. And we see in Tennessee, handcraft, maintaining the crafts that the pioneers in that particular rural area did and accomplished, and they're maintaining those. Hand weaving. Here's the Croom School, and they have a choir. And we have the listing of graduates. And this is also from the Croom School. And Wikipedia does have a list of settlement houses that still exist, or this particular one is from Chicago, and some of these still exist today, still operating, still operating, still operating, and the years in which they got started. There are also lists of settlement houses in the United States, Canada, as well as England that are operating today. And we do see some of the major cities, but we do see some smaller areas as well. So in conclusion, it's just another one of those resources. Did you have an immigrant ancestor that came between 1880 and 1920? One of those new recent immigrants that might have used the services provided by a settlement house? Did someone in your family work in a settlement house? I had always known that my mother worked for the Henry Street settlement, but I had no idea the true meaning of what that was about. And the large place that settlement houses took in history as well as in their social concerns. Did your family, perhaps one of your members, belong to a church or social group that contributed funding or services to a settlement house? So with that, I will close and entertain possibly any questions.
Thanks, Terry. That was great. We do not have any questions, but there is still time. So if you have a question, comment, you want to share your own little memory or something, go ahead and drop it in the chat box there. We've got a few minutes, so you can definitely do that if you want to. So much good information there. It's really, really neat to hear about your mother and her work with the women in prenatal and postnatal care. And you may have said this already, but was that a paid position or volunteer
Yes.
work?
Yes,
Okay.
it was a paid position.
Interesting. When you were talking about the conditions, the the terrible conditions, it reminded me of the book Angela's Ashes.
Oh,
Have you
yeah.
ever read that? It's
Yes.
similar
Yes.
situation, right? And oh, I remember just being so heartbroken reading about how bad it was. All right. Well, thank you for being here. Come on down to the museum anytime. We're open Wednesdays to Saturdays, 10 to 4. And we'd love to see you. And then we hope to see you for next month's genealogy. It'll be August 10th, same time and the same way to register. Thank you.
We don't know about, very rarely hear the term placing out. We often think of the term orphan trains. But the term orphan trains didn't start until 1978, when CBS did a mini series about these children that were taken from foundling homes, from their homes, abandoned. And it is also part of the progressive movement and the progressive era. So next month, we're going to be looking at placing out the orphan trains. Thank you.